The night was calm, the streetlights humming softly against the silence of the small neighborhood. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair neatly tied in a bun, walked carefully down the sidewalk, clutching her small grocery bag. She had lived in this community for decades, watching children grow into adults, watching the seasons change. To her, this neighborhood was home. But tonight felt different. The moment she stepped off the curb to cross the street, a sudden flash of red and blue lights flooded her vision. A police cruiser rolled up beside her, tires grinding against the pavement. Evelyn paused, heart skipping a beat as two officers stepped out. "Ma'am, hold it right there," one of them ordered. She blinked in confusion. "Is something wrong, officers? Mind telling us what you're doing out here this late?" The taller cop, Officer Reynolds, folded his arms. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his tone that made her uneasy. Evelyn adjusted the bag in her arms. "I just picked up some bread and milk from the store. I live 2 blocks down." The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, stepped closer. "Do you have any ID on you?" Evelyn frowned. I wasn't expecting to need one for a short walk home. Is there a problem?" Reynolds exchanged a glance with his partner. "We got reports of suspicious activity in the area." "Just routine questioning." Suspicious activity. Evelyn's grip tightened on the bag. She had lived here longer than these men had probably been alive. What was so suspicious about an elderly woman walking home with groceries? "I assure you, officers, I'm just trying to get home," she said calmly. The younger cop scoffed. "Then why are you getting nervous?" "Nervous?" She exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. "I'm not nervous. But I don't understand why I'm being stopped." Reynolds took a step forward. "Ma'am, if you're refusing to cooperate, we might have to take you in for further questioning." "Take her in." Evelyn's chest tightened. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was intimidation. She knew exactly why. For a moment, she considered arguing, standing her ground. But she had learned long ago that sometimes, words weren't enough. Some people only understood power, and fortunately, she had some in her back pocket. Slowly, Evelyn reached into her purse, ignoring the way the younger officer's hand twitched near his holster. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as she scrolled through her contacts. Then, with deliberate calm, she pressed a name and held the phone to her ear. A few rings later, a deep voice answered. "Hey, Mama. Everything okay?" Evelyn's lips curved into a small smile. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm fine, but there are 2 officers here who seem to think I'm a threat. Would you mind having a quick word with them?" There was a pause. Then a quiet, measured response. "Put one of them on the phone." Evelyn extended the phone to Reynolds, her expression unreadable. "My son would like to speak with you." The officer hesitated, narrowing his eyes. "And who exactly is your son?" She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "The U.S. Attorney General." The air around them seemed to shift. The younger officer stiffened, and Reynolds' face drained of color. He glanced at his partner, then back at the phone, his confidence suddenly faltering. Evelyn simply waited, watching the realization dawn on them. And then everything changed. Reynolds hesitated, his fingers twitching as if debating whether to take the phone. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. He locked eyes with his partner, who now stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight. Neither of them had expected this. Evelyn held the phone steady, her gaze unwavering. "Go on, officer. He's waiting." Reynolds finally reached for the phone. His movements slower now, more careful. He lifted it to his ear. Hello." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is Attorney General Carter. Who am I speaking to?" Reynolds cleared his throat, glancing quickly at his partner as if looking for a way out. Officer Reynolds, sir. We were just conducting a routine stop." "That's my mother you're harassing," the voice cut in, cool and controlled. "Explain to me why." Reynolds swallowed hard. Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity in the area, and we were just following protocol. What suspicious activity? The Attorney General's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. Because from what I understand, my 72-year-old mother was walking home with a bag of groceries. Unless you're telling me that's now considered a crime. Reynolds opened his mouth, then shut it. His partner took a small step back, suddenly very interested in the cracks on the sidewalk. Evelyn stood still, watching their reactions. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this kind of behavior before. Confident until challenged, powerful until held accountable. I'm waiting for an answer, the Attorney General pressed. Reynolds fumbled for words. Sir, we were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. The silence that followed was heavier than the night air. Then finally the Attorney General spoke again. Let me be very clear. You are speaking to the highest law enforcement officer in the country. And you just admitted to stopping my mother without cause. That sounds like profiling to me, Officer Reynolds. Do you want to explain yourself further, or should I have internal affairs do it for you? Reynolds' grip on the phone tightened, his face now visibly pale. His partner shifted uncomfortably, taking another small step away, as if hoping to disappear altogether. No, sir. That won't be necessary, Reynolds finally muttered. Then I suggest you return her phone, apologize, and let her go. Immediately. Reynolds swallowed hard and pulled the phone from his ear, his eyes darting between Evelyn and his partner. With shaky hands, he extended the phone back to her. Here you go, ma'am. His voice was suddenly much softer, almost polite. Evelyn took the phone without a word, bringing it back to her ear. Thank you, sweetheart. Her son's voice was steady. Are you okay, Mama? She smiled, though her eyes remained sharp. I'm fine now, baby. I'll be home soon. A brief pause then. Call me when you get there. I will. She ended the call and slid the phone back into her purse. For a moment the street was silent. The two officers stood stiffly, their earlier authority now replaced with discomfort. Reynolds cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at her. Our apologies, ma'am. You're free to go. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Free to go. She let the words settle in the air. I wasn't aware I was ever being detained. Neither officer had an answer for that. She held their gaze for a moment longer before adjusting the strap of her purse and stepping past them. Her steps slow and deliberate. She wasn't afraid anymore, she never had been. As she walked down the sidewalk, she could still feel their eyes on her, still hear the quiet shuffle of their boots as they shifted awkwardly. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world was changing and people like them were finally starting to realize it. Evelyn walked home without looking back, but she could still feel the weight of the encounter pressing on her chest. The way the officers had looked at her, the way their tones had shifted only after realizing who she was connected to. It wasn't new. She had lived through worse. But it still left a bitter taste in her mouth. When she reached her front porch, she let out a slow breath and pulled out her keys. The house was quiet as she stepped inside, setting her grocery bag on the kitchen counter. She turned on the small lamp near the window, casting a warm glow over the room. The familiarity of home should have brought her comfort, but her mind was still racing. She had almost laughed at the way those officers had stiffened at her son's name. Almost. But the truth was, it wasn't funny. If she had been anyone else, someone without connections, without power, how would that situation have ended? The thought made her stomach turn. Her phone vibrated on the table and she reached for it. A text from her son. You home safe? She smiled slightly, texting back, yes. Love you. A response came almost immediately. Love you too. Get some rest. She wished it were that simple. The next morning, the world outside her door felt different, even though everything looked the same. She went about her routine, watering her plants, reading the newspaper with her morning coffee. But there was an uneasy feeling in the air. Maybe it was the way her neighbor, Mrs. Jackson, looked at her a little too long as she walked past. Or the way a car she didn't recognize drove slowly down the street before disappearing around the corner. By midday, the feeling hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Then a knock at the door. Evelyn set her mug down and made her way over, peering through the peephole. A young man in a suit stood on her porch, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't look like a salesman. Something about him was too polished, too formal. She opened the door but didn't step aside. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Carter, my name is Daniel Wright. I work with the local district attorney's office. May I come in?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment. The district attorney. That wasn't what she had expected. She didn't move. "And why would the district attorney's office be interested in me?" His smile didn't falter. "It's about the incident last night. We wanted to speak with you regarding the officers involved." That caught her off guard. She had assumed the matter was over. She hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. "Come in." Daniel walked in, taking in the house with quick, observant eyes. Evelyn led him to the living room, where he took a seat on the couch while she remained standing. "You mind telling me what this is really about?" she asked. He folded his hands. "We're aware that your son intervened in the situation last night. As you can imagine, that's unusual." Evelyn's lips pressed together. "Unusual?" He exhaled, as if choosing his words carefully. "It's not every day that a routine stop leads to a direct call from the Attorney General. The department is under scrutiny now. There are questions about whether the officers involved acted improperly. Internal Affairs is reviewing the case." Evelyn crossed her arms. "And you want me to help clear their names?" Daniel shook his head. "No. I want the truth." That answer surprised her. She studied him again, this time looking past the polished appearance. There was something genuine in his tone, a seriousness that made her believe he wasn't just here to cover things up. She sat down across from him. "Then ask your questions." Daniel leaned forward. "Did the officers give you a reason for stopping you?" "They claimed it was a routine check," she said evenly. He nodded. "Did they ever accuse you of anything specific? Say anything threatening?" Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. "They implied I was being uncooperative when I asked why I was being stopped. One of them suggested taking me in for questioning." Daniel scribbled something down in a small notebook. "And after your son got involved, they changed their tone." There was a long pause before Daniel looked up at her. "Mrs. Carter, I won't lie to you. This case is bigger than it seems. There's been talk that this wasn't an isolated incident." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated. "There have been multiple reports of unnecessary stops in this area. Similar complaints about profiling. But none of the cases got attention, until now." Evelyn leaned back, the weight of his words settling over her. "You're saying they've done this before?" Daniel nodded. "And not just them. It's a pattern." Evelyn exhaled slowly, suddenly understanding why the officers had been so nervous last night. They weren't just worried about her. They were worried about what would happen if their actions became part of something bigger. "And what happens now?" she asked. Daniel closed his notebook. "That depends. If you're willing, your statement could make a difference. The department won't be able to ignore this if the Attorney General's own mother speaks out." Evelyn thought about it. She had never been one to seek attention. But this wasn't about her. It was about all the others who didn't have someone powerful to call. She met Daniel's eyes. "Then let's make sure they can't ignore it." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "I'll be in touch soon." As he left, Evelyn sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window. The sun had risen high in the sky, casting long shadows over the street. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Evelyn spent the next few days thinking about everything Daniel had told her. The weight of it sat heavy on her chest, not because she was afraid, but because she knew this was bigger than just her. It wasn't just about two officers stopping an elderly woman on her way home. It was about the ones who never got to walk away, the ones who had no one to call. She knew speaking out would draw attention, good and bad. She had seen what happened to people who made too much noise. But silence had never changed anything. Late one evening, as she was preparing for bed, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something told her to answer. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello." There was a brief pause before a deep voice spoke. "Mrs. Carter, this is Captain Mitchell from the precinct." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "Captain, what can I do for you? I was hoping we could have a conversation." His tone was polite, but there was something else beneath it, something careful. "Would you be open to meeting me at the station? I believe we can clear up a few things." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Clear up what exactly?" Another pause. "I understand you spoke with the district attorney's office. I'd like to discuss the matter in person." It wasn't a request. Evelyn had dealt with men like this before. The kind who smiled while applying pressure. The kind who pretended they were asking when they were really demanding. She glanced out her window, scanning the street. The same unfamiliar car she'd seen a few days ago was parked across from her house. She didn't like coincidences. She took a breath. "I appreciate the offer, Captain, but I have nothing to clear up. I was stopped without cause. I was questioned like a suspect. And I don't need a private meeting to know that was wrong." The line was silent for a moment, and then the captain sighed. "Mrs. Carter, you're a respected member of this community. I'd hate for this situation to become complicated." There it was. Evelyn's voice remained steady. "It's already complicated, Captain. But not because of me." Another beat of silence. Then a forced chuckle. "You're a sharp woman, Mrs. Carter. I see where your son gets it from." The line went dead. Evelyn set the phone down, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. They were watching her. They were trying to pressure her. That only meant one thing. This was bigger than she had thought. The next morning, she wasn't surprised when Daniel called. "We need to talk," he said. "Something's happening." They met at a quiet coffee shop just outside town, away from prying eyes. Daniel looked tense. His usual calm replaced with urgency. "What's going on?" Evelyn asked as she took a seat. Daniel glanced around before lowering his voice. "Someone's trying to make this go away. Witnesses who came forward about other stops are suddenly changing their statements. A few have stopped answering calls altogether." Evelyn exhaled sharply. "They're scared." He nodded. "And I don't blame them. But it's more than that. I did some digging. The officers who stopped you. They're part of a task force that's been operating under the radar. Supposedly cracking down on crime, but their records show a pattern. Stopping people without cause, intimidating them, making reports disappear." Evelyn folded her arms. "And now they're trying to make me disappear from this too." Daniel leaned in. "You don't have to do this, Mrs. Carter. If you step back, they'll let this fade. But if you push forward," he hesitated, "they'll push back." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Are you asking me to be quiet?" "No," Daniel shook his head. "I'm asking if you're ready for what happens next." Evelyn looked out the window, the world outside moving as if nothing was happening. But something was happening. And it had been happening long before she got involved. She turned back to Daniel, her voice firm. "I've been ready my whole life." That night, as she sat in her living room, she felt the shift in the air. The storm was coming. The only question was how far they were willing to go to keep the truth buried. Evelyn sat in the dim glow of her living room lamp, the quiet hum of the clock on the wall filling the silence. She knew the risks of standing her ground, but she also knew backing down had never changed anything. Her son had worked his entire life to uphold justice, but even with all his power, she knew there were forces that operated beyond the reach of the law, forces that thrived in the shadows in fear and silence. A sudden noise outside made her sit up straighter. Car door shutting. Slow footsteps on pavement. Her heartbeat quickened. She got up and moved toward the window, carefully parting the curtains just enough to see. The unfamiliar car was back, idling across the street. The silhouette of a man stood just beyond the glow of the street lamp. He wasn't moving, just watching. Evelyn's fingers hovered over her phone. Should she call her son? Daniel? No, not yet. She needed to know what she was dealing with first. She stepped away from the window, took a steadying breath, and went to the front door. She unlocked it but didn't open it fully, keeping the chain in place. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice firm. The man didn't move closer. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice calm, almost polite. "I think you should reconsider your involvement in this situation." Evelyn's grip on the door tightened. "And who exactly are you?" The man let out a slow breath, as if he had been expecting that question. "Just someone who understands how quickly things can get difficult." There it was again, that veiled threat, that quiet warning disguised as concern. Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "Tell whoever sent you that I don't scare easy." The man gave a slight nod, as if he respected her defiance. Then he turned and walked back toward the car. The engine rumbled to life, and within seconds, the vehicle disappeared down the street. Evelyn shut the door, locking it behind her. She had no doubt now. This wasn't just about those two officers. This was bigger. And someone was trying to make sure she didn't pull the wrong thread. The next morning, before she could even process the events of the night before, her phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mrs. Carter, something's happened," he said, his voice tense. "One of the officers from your case, Reynolds, was found unconscious in his patrol car early this morning. No signs of struggle, no forced entry." Evelyn frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this wasn't random," Daniel said. "Someone wants to clean this up before we dig any deeper." Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine. The pressure was escalating. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were covering their tracks. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I think I was paid a visit last night." Silence on the other end. Then, "Tell me everything." Evelyn recounted the encounter, every word, every movement. She could hear Daniel scribbling notes, piecing things together. "This confirms it," he said finally. "They know you won't stay quiet, so now they're trying to control the situation. But it also means they're scared." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "Which means we're close." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "And that makes this the most dangerous part." Evelyn nodded to herself, gripping the phone a little tighter. She wasn't just in the middle of this fight anymore. She was at the center of something much bigger than she had realized. And the people pulling the strings weren't going to let her walk away so easily. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The weight of everything pressed down on her, but she refused to let fear dictate her next move. If they thought intimidation would make her walk away, they had underestimated her. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Daniel. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to meet. Now." Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. "Where?" He gave her an address, a parking garage downtown. Strange choice, but she trusted him. Evelyn grabbed her coat and purse, locking up behind her. As she drove, she noticed the same car from the night before appearing in her rearview mirror. It wasn't a coincidence. They were still watching. She didn't speed, didn't panic. Instead, she pulled into the garage and parked, her hands steady as she stepped out. Daniel was already there, standing near a concrete pillar, his expression tense. "We have a problem," he said as soon as she reached him. Evelyn folded her arms. "Just one." Daniel gave a humorless chuckle before lowering his voice. "I found something. Records that were supposed to be buried. The officers that stopped you. They weren't just part of a task force. They were part of something off the books. An operation meant to keep certain undesirable people in check." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "And by undesirable, you mean people like me?" Daniel nodded grimly. "This goes deep. High-ranking officials. People who don't want this exposed." That's why Reynolds was taken out of play. He knew too much. And now, a sudden noise cut him off. A step. Evelyn turned sharply. Two men in suits were approaching. They weren't police. And they weren't here for conversation. Daniel took a step closer to her. "Stay behind me." One of the men spoke first. "You've been asking a lot of questions." His tone was smooth, almost bored. "That's not good for anyone." Evelyn didn't flinch. "You mean it's not good for you?" The man smirked. "Same thing." He turned his gaze to Daniel. "Hand over the files." Daniel didn't move. "Not happening." The second man sighed as if this was an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Listen, we're giving you both a way out. Walk away and this all disappears. Keep pushing and, well, you know how these things go." Evelyn's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. She had spent too many years watching injustice from the sidelines. Not this time. She took a slow step forward. "You don't get to decide how this ends." The man laughed. "Lady, you have no idea what you're dealing with." Before he could say another word, the sound of sirens echoed through the garage. Tires screeched, and black SUVs pulled in from every entrance. Within seconds, armed federal agents were surrounding them, weapons drawn. Evelyn stayed perfectly still as the two men froze, their cocky expressions vanishing. A voice cut through the chaos. "Step away from my mother." Evelyn turned to see her son, the Attorney General, stepping out of one of the SUVs. His face unreadable. The two men didn't resist as agents moved in, cuffing them without a struggle. They knew it was over. Evelyn let out a slow breath. "Took you long enough." Her son gave her a small smile. "I had to let you have your moment." Daniel handed over the files. "This is everything. Names, dates, evidence. Enough to bring the whole operation down." The Attorney General nodded. "We'll make sure it sees the light of day." Evelyn looked at the men being loaded into vehicles, their power stripped away in an instant. They had tried to silence her, but they had only given her a louder voice. As she stood there watching justice unfold, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. This was about every person who had been stopped, questioned, or ignored simply because of who they were. And for the first time in a long time, she knew change was coming. Evelyn watched as the last of the black SUVs disappeared down the street, the cold night air wrapping around her. The parking garage, once filled with tension, now felt strangely quiet. Daniel stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, watching just as she was. "Well," he said after a moment, "I guess that's that." Evelyn gave a small nod. "For now." Her son, the Attorney General, walked over, his usual composed expression softening as he looked at her. "Mom, you okay?" She turned to him, a proud but tired smile on her face. "You know me. I don't break easy." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You never did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say about what had just happened. It had all played out exactly as it needed to. The men who thought they could manipulate the system had been caught in their own web. But Evelyn knew this wasn't the end. Corruption didn't disappear overnight. Daniel checked his phone. "The files are already being processed. This is going to shake things up. There are people in high places who are about to lose a lot of power." Evelyn met his gaze. "Good. Maybe it'll make them think twice next time." Her son studied her for a moment, then chuckled. "You were always meant to be in a courtroom, Mom." She shook her head, smiling. "No. I was always meant to be exactly where I am." Her son sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I should have known you'd never let this go quietly." Evelyn reached out, touching his arm gently. "Because quiet never changed anything, baby. And you didn't get where you are by staying silent either." He nodded, the weight of the night still visible in his eyes. "I just don't like the idea of you being in danger." She gave him a knowing look. "You think this is the first time someone tried to silence me?" He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I guess not." Daniel's phone buzzed again and he glanced at it. I need to head back to the office. This is going to be a long night. Evelyn reached for his hand, squeezing it once. Go do what you do best. He squeezed back, then turned to leave. As he walked away, he paused. Mom. She raised a brow. He smirked. Maybe take a break from causing chaos. Just for a little while. He chuckled. No promises. As he disappeared into one of the cars, Daniel turned to her. You're incredible, you know that? Evelyn smiled, shaking her head. I'm just a woman who refuses to be ignored. Daniel gave a small nod. That's what makes you dangerous to people like them. She thought about that. Dangerous. The word usually carried a negative weight, but in this case she liked it. Because if being dangerous meant holding people accountable, then maybe the world needed a few more people like her. The two of them left the garage together, stepping out into the crisp night air. The streets were quiet, the city lights flickering in the distance. You need a ride? Daniel asked. Evelyn shook her head. I'll walk. I need some air. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. All right. But be careful. He smirked. Always. As she walked down the sidewalk, she let the events of the night settle in. She had faced threats, intimidation, and power plays from people who thought they controlled everything. But in the end they had been wrong. Because power didn't come from a badge or a title. It came from knowing right from wrong and refusing to look away. She stopped at a street corner, looking up at the city skyline. She had no doubt that somewhere, someone else was already plotting their next move, trying to keep their grip on the system. But now they knew something they hadn't before. Evelyn Carter wasn't someone they could silence. And neither were the people who would follow her example.